For coming. My name is Anthony Hughes. I'm a retired generally related events into which these proceedings will need to 18. The second happened nearly 4 months later and about 8 of public attention and an almost equal amount of speculation without making any assumptions about the accuracy of anything is to examine the evidence and to say what conclusions the evidence either does or doesn't justify. The second event has attracted rather less attention, but it is the second event, the untimely death of Dawn Sturgess at the end of June, the beginning of July of 2018, which is the reason why this inquiry is taking place. Any sudden and untimely death like that calls for a coroner's inquest and for findings of fact about how the deceased came to die. These proceedings began as just such an inquest. But an inquest can't investigate classified material where there is some, such as might affect national security or personal safety, and of that there is some here. So the inquest was converted into a public inquiry which does have the power to investigate that kind of material and to close some of its sessions so that it can do so. This remains at root an investigation into the sudden death of an entirely private person who had no kind of public role or profile. I should be very grateful if all of us who are minded to comment would do their utmost to remember that it is for a real family all about a private tragedy and a private loss. The members of her family are welcome here, and we should begin by assuring them of our understanding, so far as we are able, and of our sympathy. Now I shall ask Mr. O'Connor, on behalf of the inquiry legal team, to introduce the material which we shall be looking at, and after that we will hear opening statements of other core participants. Mr. O'Connor.
Dawn Sturgess died on the 8th of July 2018 at the age of just 44. She died at the Salisbury District Hospital, which is only about 2 miles from where we are now. The purpose of the inquiry that starts its public hearings this morning here in Salisbury Guildhall is to investigate the circumstances of her death. And it is no exaggeration to say that the circumstances of Dawn Sturgess's death were extraordinary. They were indeed unique. As you will hear, sir, Dawn Sturgess lived a life that was wholly removed from the worlds of politics and international relations. She was born here in Salisbury and spent the rest of her life in and near the city. She had 3 children. Her life was not without its challenges, but she faced those challenges with the support of friends and a loving family. The circumstances of Dawn's life stand in stark contrast to the circumstances of her death. She died an unnatural and a wholly unexpected death, poisoned by a military-grade chemical weapon. The poison, you will hear, was known as Novichok, a nerve agent, more properly a class of nerve agents, said to have been developed by Russian government agencies in the final years of the Cold War. A particularly shocking feature of Dawn Sturgess's death is that she unwittingly applied the poison to her own skin. She was entirely unaware of the mortal danger she faced because the highly toxic liquid had been concealed, carefully and deliberately concealed, inside a perfume bottle. Moreover, the evidence will suggest that this bottle, which we shall hear contained enough poison to kill thousands of people, must earlier have been left somewhere in a public place, creating the obvious risk that someone would find it and take it home. You may conclude, sir, that those who discarded the bottle in this way acted with a grotesque disregard for human life. Unsurprisingly in the circumstances, Dawn Sturgess's death attracted both national and international publicity and has become the focus of widespread public concern. As soon as it became known that Dawn had been poisoned with Novichok, her case was inevitably linked with another incident that, as you have said, sir, had taken place in Salisbury some 4 months earlier, and which had, if anything, gained even wider notoriety. Unlike Dawn Sturgess, and as you will hear, both Sergei and Yulia Skripal survived, albeit having suffered very serious symptoms and having spent lengthy periods in hospital. In the days that followed the Skripal poisoning, Her Majesty's government had taken the exceptional step of publicly accusing the Russian government of bearing responsibility for the attack. Thereafter, in fact, shortly after Dawn Sturgess's death, charges, including charges of attempting to murder the Skripals, were laid against 2 men who are believed to have travelled to Salisbury on the day of the poisoning and to have applied the poison to Sergei Skripal's front door handle. Both men are believed to be members of the GRU and to have travelled to this country under alias. Sometime later, similar charges were laid against a 3rd man who was present in the UK at the time of the poisoning and who is believed to be a member of the GRU and to have entered the UK using a false name. So, when Dawn Sturgess was poisoned by Novichok 4 months later, the real possibility emerged that she had been caught, an innocent victim, in the crossfire of an illegal and outrageous international assassination attempt. Whether or not that is in fact what happened will, of course, be for you to determine. I hope it is already apparent, sir, that the 2 cases to which I've referred are inextricably interwoven. It is not possible to investigate Dawn Sturgess's death properly without understanding the Skripal poisoning. There are key questions regarding possible connections between the 2 cases that the evidence may enable you to answer. For example, was the Novichok that killed Dawn Sturgess the same type of chemical that poisoned Sergei and Yulia Skripal? Can it be said that the nerve agent in each case was in fact identical? Indeed, can it be determined that the nerve agent in both cases was part of a single batch? Is it possible to say whether the bottle of Novichok that poisoned Dawn Sturgess had been used in the attack on the Skripals? Might there have been a second container? If it was the same bottle, how did a container brought to Salisbury at the beginning of March 2018 come to be in Dawn Sturgess's possession in Amesbury with such tragic consequences at the end of June 2018? Should the bottle have been found in the meantime? And a question that Dawn Sturgess's family are particularly concerned that you should investigate: had the UK government taken appropriate steps to protect both Sergei Skripal from attack and the wider public from the collateral damage of any such attack? To put the same question another way, is it possible that mistakes were made in protecting Sergei Skripal that might indirectly have contributed to Dawn Sturgess's death? I've already referred to the fact that the hearings that we are commencing this morning form one part of a public inquiry. That is to say, an inquiry established under Section 1 of the Inquiries Act 2005. It is obviously important that those following this inquiry understand its purpose and, at least in broad terms, its scope and how it will function. I'll therefore spend a few minutes, sir, saying something about how and why the inquiry was set up and about its history to date. As with any other violent or unnatural death, Dawn's death was initially the subject of an investigation by the local coroner. After receiving legal submissions, he decided to conduct a narrow investigation into her death. His proposed investigation would have included the actions of the two men to whom I've referred, but would not have included the actions of others associated with them, nor would it have addressed the question of who directed their conduct, including the issue of potential Russian state responsibility. The coroner also intended to exclude from his investigation any question as to where the Novichok had come from. The Sturgess family successfully challenged the coroner's decision in the High Court. I don't intend to spend any time now on the detail of the court's decision. A copy of the judgment can be found on the inquiry website. But in summary, the court gave strong guidance that the investigation into Dawn's death ought to be broader than the coroner had proposed. Paragraph 88 of the court's ruling, which I will read, explains why it took this view. I quote, "There is acute and obvious public concern, not merely at the prima facie evidence that an attempt was made on British soil by Russian agents to assassinate Mr. Skripal and that it led to the death of Ms. Sturgess, but also at the fact that it involved the use of a prohibited nerve agent, exposing the population of Salisbury and Amesbury to lethal risk. There has been, and to be realistic, there will be, no criminal trial in which the details of how this appalling event came to occur can be publicly examined." End quote. In January 2021, some months after the High Court ruling, Baroness Hallett was appointed to conduct the inquest into Dawn Sturgess's death in place of the coroner. In April 2021, she ruled that her investigation would be a wide one and that it would include the question of potential Russian state responsibility for the Skripal poisoning and also the source of the Novichok. That ruling is also to be found on the inquiry website. Lady Hallett's decision to adopt a wider scope caused a further procedural difficulty. As she recognised in the ruling to which I have just referred, a thorough investigation into issues such as the source of the Novichok and possible Russian state responsibility for the Skripal poisoning would inevitably require consideration of highly sensitive material held by UK government bodies. That material could not be admitted into evidence in an inquest where closed hearings are not permitted. This was an identical problem to that which arose some years ago in the investigation into the death of Alexander Litvinenko and subsequently the inquests into those killed in the Manchester Arena bombing. In the end, the same solution was adopted here as had been used in those cases. That is, the conversion of the inquest into a public inquiry. As the chair of a public inquiry, you have the power, where you consider it appropriate, to admit sensitive evidence in secret or closed session. As I've said, that is a power that a coroner conducting an inquest does not have. The public inquiry was established by the Home Secretary with a formal setting up date of the 17th of March 2022. It had been intended that Lady Hallett would be appointed as chair of the inquiry, but she stepped down from that role following her appointment as the chair of the UK COVID-19 public inquiry. And it was at that point that you, sir, were appointed to chair this inquiry. Having mentioned the COVID inquiry, it may be helpful to emphasise that although both that inquiry and this have been established under the 2005 Act, they are very different beasts indeed. The COVID inquiry, like some other recent inquiries, has a very broad remit to examine whole sections of state activity within an extended time period and to consider wide-ranging recommendations for the future. This inquiry, by contrast, is a targeted investigation into the circumstances, albeit the broad circumstances, surrounding a single event, namely the death of Dawn Sturgess. In substance, you are performing the role of a coroner with the added powers of the chair of a public inquiry, and that is reflected in the inquiry's terms of reference, which are on the screens now. Those terms of reference define your role, sir, in very much the same way as that of a coroner conducting an inquest. You will be familiar, sir, with a number of well-known judicial statements that have been made about the way in which coroners should investigate deaths. In the case of Thompson, Lord Lane stated that, and I quote, "The function of an inquest is to seek out and record as many of the facts concerning the death as the public interest requires." In the case of Jameson, Sir Thomas Bingham, then the Master of the Rolls, referred to the need for a coroner to conduct a full, fair and fearless investigation, and in doing so to, in his words, ensure that the relevant facts are exposed to public scrutiny, particularly if there is evidence of foul play, abuse or inhumanity. And in the later case of Amin, Lord Bingham, as he had by then become, described the purpose of a coronial investigation as being, again in his words, to ensure, so far as possible, that the full facts are brought to light, that culpable and discreditable conduct is exposed and brought to public notice, that suspicion of deliberate wrongdoing, if unjustified, is allayed, that dangerous practices and procedures are rectified, and that those who have lost their relative may at least have the satisfaction of knowing that lessons learned from her death may save the lives of others. We respectfully submit that all of those principles apply directly to your role as chair of this inquiry. Before I move on from procedural matters, sir, let me address head-on the question that, quite understandably, observers often ask about this case. Why has it all taken so long? It is 6 years since Dawn Sturgess died. That is a long time to wait for answers, especially, of course, for her family. Legal process does take time, and the process I have just described has been a complex one. The coroner spent some time reaching his initial decision on scope. There was then the High Court Judicial Review challenge, the appointment of Baroness Hallett to conduct the inquest, then her rulings on scope, which in turn prompted the conversion to an inquiry and your appointment 2.5 years ago. That is one explanation for the delay. The other distinguishing feature of this case, which has certainly added to the time that it has taken to reach these hearings, is the difficulty and thoroughness of the disclosure process. One of the themes of the guidance of Lord Lane and Lord Bingham that I mentioned a moment ago is that of transparency, the need to expose as much detail as possible, particularly culpable or discreditable conduct, to public scrutiny. The same requirement appears in Section 18 of the 2005 Act. I've already made the point that in this case you will, of necessity, hear some highly sensitive evidence in closed session. The principle of transparency does not prohibit closed evidence, but what it does require is that you only permit evidence to be heard in closed where that is absolutely necessary. It is for that reason, sir, to make the open element of these proceedings as wide as possible, and conversely to minimise the content of the closed hearings, that you have spent much of the last 18 months painstakingly reviewing restriction order applications over thousands of documents on a line-by-line basis. There is no question that this process has added considerably to the time that would otherwise have been taken in preparing for these hearings. But that process has been of great value. The result of it, in practical terms, is that we will be able to hear a great deal of evidence about this case in the open, public sessions that are starting today. I now turn to introduce in a little detail the core factual issues that we will be exploring in evidence in the coming weeks. Those are the issues that, at the end of this process, you will address in your report. I've already mentioned some of the issues, and I hope it will be clear from what I've said so far that many of the issues overlap. There is, of course, the inquiry's provisional list of issues. That document is the product of debate at the inquiry's preliminary hearings and subsequent refinement. It's available on the inquiry website. It is a comprehensive document, and I don't propose to read it out. Rather, I propose to spend the next hour or so evidence at the open hearings we are commencing today. Second, the broader factual circumstance, medical treatment, including the adequacy of the medical treatment provided to Dawn Sturgess and the bottle that it was found in. So was the poisoning of Dawn Sturgess prevent the immediate circumstances of her death? So in your opening remarks, we must not and we will not lose sight of Dawn Sturgess, the individual, and of her family's grief. Caroline Sturgess, Dawn's mother, will give evidence tomorrow morning. She will provide a pen portrait of Dawn. She will tell us something of the life Dawn enjoyed with her parents, her children, her sisters. We will hear that Dawn grew up and lived almost all her life in and near Salisbury. As a child, she attended Durrington Secondary School. She had a close and supportive family and also a strong network of friends. We will hear evidence from Charlie Rowley, who was Dawn's partner at the time she died, about the life they had been living together for 16 months or so before her death. In an interview that he gave after her death, Charlie Rowley described Dawn as a lovely lady. She had a big heart. She'd help anyone if she could. Dawn's mother has said that Dawn was the happiest she'd been for a long time when she was together with Charlie. Charlie himself has described their relationship as being very happy, supportive and loving. As you will hear, Charlie Rowley was also poisoned by the Novichok. He was hospitalised and suffered serious symptoms. He also, of course, suffered a bereavement. To use his own words in a television interview, "It's my girlfriend I lost, my partner, my soulmate." You will also hear evidence that Dawn suffered from long-term dependence on alcohol, which limited her ability to work and affected her personal life. Her family recall that in the months and weeks before her death, Dawn was showing signs of improvement in her health and well-being. As I've said, she was settled and happy in a romantic relationship. She was looking forward to moving into her own flat in Amesbury, where she would have been close to Charlie. As to the immediate cause and mechanism of Dawn Sturgess's death, Professor Rutty, who conducted the post-mortem and who will be giving oral evidence to you, recorded the cause of death as 1A, post-cardiac arrest, hypoxic brain injury and intracerebral hemorrhage, 1B, Novichok toxicity. In layman's terms, and adding a little detail, the poison caused Dawn's nervous system to become overstimulated, which led to heart failure. That in turn caused Dawn's brain to be starved of oxygen. As we will hear, when paramedics arrived at the scene, they performed CPR and managed to restart her heart. She was taken to hospital and treated for several days. But the damage that had been done to her brain from the lack of oxygen during that initial period gradually developed and worsened over the days that Dawn was in hospital. In the end, as Professor Rutty will explain, it was the brain injury that was the immediate cause of her death. I turn to the second issue, sir, the narrative of broader factual circumstances of the two poisonings, that of the Skripals and that of Dawn Sturgess. And I start with Sergei and Yulia Skripal. In 2018, Sergei Skripal was a Russian man in his mid-60s, living in Christie Miller Road, a quiet cul-de-sac in Salisbury, one of the residential streets between Devizes Road and Wilson Road to the west of the city centre. He was a man with an unusual past. We will hear that Sergei Skripal had been born in Russia and that he had served first as a paratrooper in the Russian army and latterly as a member of the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence. In 2004, he was convicted in Russia on espionage charges. Reportedly, the allegations against him were that he had spied for Britain. He was subsequently sentenced to a 13-year term of imprisonment, but in 2010, he was given a presidential pardon and was brought to the UK in a prisoner exchange. We will hear that Sergei Skripal had lived in Salisbury since 2010, for most of that time in the house on Christie Miller Road. After his arrival in the UK, his family, his wife, his son and daughter, had left Russia to live with him. But his wife and son had subsequently died, and his daughter had returned to Russia. His daughter, 2018, the day before the poisoning. We will hear about the events of that Saturday. A larger vehicle took him to Heathrow to collect Yulia. We will hear about Sergei and Yulia returning to the house in Christie Miller Road from Heathrow, what they did that evening, and also, of course, about the events of Skripal left the house to drive into the middle of Salisbury in the early afternoon at about 1:30 on Sunday the 4th of March. We will hear detailed evidence as to exactly what they did as they left the house. door handle on the way out of the house that they were poisoned with Novichok. We will be able to see from CCTV, if we could have please INQ 005819, Devizes Road towards the city centre at about 13:35. They then parked on the roof of the Sainsbury's car park next to the Maltings shopping centre. They walked through the Maltings, and if we can have please INQ 005819, page 69, thank you. We see them stopping to feed the ducks in the river on their walk away from the car park. They're in that box with an arrow pointing at them. They then went to the Bishop's Mill pub, arriving at 1:45, and we see here, this is INQ 5819, page 69, photo 6. This photo shows the two of them arriving at the Bishop's Mill pub. They stayed at the pub for half an hour, leaving at 2:15. By now, it was about 45 minutes since they had touched the front door handle as they left the house. Sergei Skripal appears to have put his hand to his head as he left the pub. We can see that in this picture, which is INQ 00581970. Before he was joined by his daughter, Yulia, outside the pub. The same reference number. This is photograph 8. Thank you.
So that's leaving the pub?
That's right, sir. Yes, leaving the Bishop's Mill pub at about 2:15 in the afternoon. They then walked the short distance to the Zizi's restaurant in Castle Street, where they stayed for a little over an hour, leaving at 3:35. It was now 2 hours since they had touched the front door handle. They walked back through the Maltings, as we can see in this photograph, INQ 005819. We see here an enlarged version of that photograph, the two of them walking through the Maltings, arm in arm.
So can I understand it, Mr. O'Connor? These are, as it were, fortuitously, are they, photographs that happen to have been registered on one or other CCTV system in the city centre?
Exactly. So they were recovered after the event from the CCTV system.
Right.
2 minutes after the time of the photograph that we are looking at, Sergei and Yulia Skripal sat down on a bench in the Maltings, close in fact to where they had fed the ducks earlier whilst walking from the car park. And if we can have INQ 00581973, photo or camera 13, thank you. One can see in the distance in that photograph in the yellow box, that is Sergei and Yulia Skripal sitting on the bench shortly after 3:35 in the afternoon. They were still there half an hour or so later when passing members of the public, from whom we shall hear evidence, realised that they were in distress. An ambulance was called and the Skripals were given first aid. In addition to evidence from CCTV, such as, thank you, can take that down now, such as we've just been looking at, also the statements of passers-by and the evidence of those who provided emergency care, we will also be able to adduce first-hand evidence about these matters from Sergei and Yulia Skripal themselves. We have lengthy transcripts of police interviews that they gave after they had recovered from the initial effects of the poisoning. Also, witness statements which they produced at the time, and further witness statements that both of them have produced much more recently at your request. I should make it clear, though, that neither Sergei nor Yulia Skripal will be giving live oral evidence to the inquiry. That is the consequence of a ruling that you gave about 3 weeks ago, which has attracted some publicity and also commentary. Amongst that commentary, sir, was a tweet from the Russian embassy which asserted that your ruling, and I quote, demonstrates the British authorities' obstinacy in concealing our citizens. The full reasons for the decision that you took are set out in your ruling, which is dated the 23rd of September of this year and which is to be found published on the inquiry website. In light of the embassy tweet, may I simply make two further points. First, you are not the British authorities. Rather, you are the chair of a public inquiry that is entirely independent of the British government. Second, the core reason for your decision not to call the Skripals to give oral evidence, as explained, as I've mentioned, in your ruling, was in fact the risk of physical attack by whomever it might be on one or both of them, a risk which you concluded clearly outweighed the advantage to the inquiry of them attending to give oral evidence. Returning to the different strands of evidence, we shall also hear details of the testing for Novichok contamination that was undertaken at Sergei Skripal's house at 47 Christie Miller Road. If we could have, please, INQ 005819, that is a picture of the house, and also, of course, at many other locations. You will hear live evidence from the police investigators and scientists responsible for this work as to their analysis and the conclusions that can properly be drawn. I've already mentioned, for example, their key conclusion that it was the outside front door handle at 47 Christie Miller Road. We see that in an enlargement of that photograph.
So it's a lever-type handle on the front door?
It is, sir, yes. Yeah. And you will see that many of the witnesses, including, of course, Sergei and Yulia, were asked to describe exactly how it worked, what they had touched on that day, and so on. So, as I've said, the key conclusion they drew was that it was this door handle that was the source, or in their term, the ground zero of the Novichok contamination. So there's one further matter to address before leaving the narrative evidence relating to Sergei Skripal. I mentioned a few minutes ago the fact that Sergei Skripal was convicted in Russia on espionage charges, reportedly for spying for the UK. Unsurprisingly, given that conviction and subsequent events, there has been much public speculation on the related questions as to whether Sergei Skripal was in fact a British agent prior to his arrest and conviction, and also whether he worked for British intelligence agencies following his release and moved to the UK. Those two factual questions are of obvious importance to your investigation, not least because they may go towards indicating either the presence or equally an absence of a possible motive on the part of the Russian state for attempting to kill Sergei Skripal. The government, HMG, is of course able to provide evidence as to whether either or both of those factual allegations, i.e. whether Sergei Skripal worked with UK intelligence agencies before and or after he arrived in the UK, whether either or both of those allegations is true. But in a ruling that you gave on the 3rd of November 2023, you ruled that HMG will not be required to provide this evidence in open. As with other rulings that I've mentioned, that particular ruling is available on the inquiry website. And your reasoning on this issue is to be found at paragraph 15 of that ruling. In essence, you accepted that to depart from the so-called NCND, or neither confirm nor deny principle, by requiring HMG to confirm or deny that Sergei Skripal was a British agent, would cause unjustifiable damage to national security. As the legal cases explain, the reason for that general principle is not only to protect individuals whose activity is questioned, but also, and more importantly, to ensure that anyone who may give information to the British authorities, now or in the future, can be confident that whatever their relationship with them may be, the authorities will never be required to discuss it publicly. There is no doubt, sir, that the question of whether Sergei Skripal did or did not have a relationship with UK intelligence agencies, and more detailed questions that may follow are of great importance to your investigation. To borrow Lord Bingham's words, those matters will be examined both fully and fearlessly. But the consequence of your ruling, to which I have referred, is that we will explore those matters not in the open hearings that begin today, but rather in the closed evidence sessions that the inquiry will hold subsequently. I turn now to the broader factual circumstances surrounding Dawn Sturgess's death. Later this week, we will call evidence relating to Dawn's movements and activities, both on the day before she was poisoned and on the day itself. On the day before she was poisoned, that is Friday, the 29th of June, 2018, we will hear that Dawn spent the day with her partner, Charlie Rowley, and other friends in Salisbury, for much of the day enjoying the summer sunshine. During the day, Dawn Sturgess, Charlie Rowley and friends came and went from Dawn's room in John Baker House in Salisbury. They shopped and they spent some of the afternoon in Queen Elizabeth Gardens. They then returned to Dawn's room, as I said, in John Baker House. Later that evening, about 9:30 p.m, Dawn and Charlie left John Baker House and caught a bus to Amesbury. They went to Charlie's flat on Muggleton Road in Amesbury and spent the night there.
So Dawn lives at this time in Salisbury and Charlie in Amesbury.
That's correct, sir.
Thank you.
And there are plentiful sources of evidence of Dawn's movement on that Friday, from Charlie and the others that she was with, from other witnesses who remembered seeing or talking to her and gave statements to the police, and also from CCTV. That evidence, as I've said, will be considered in more detail later this week. For present purposes, I just ask that one set of photos, that's INQ 00581998, thank you, is brought up. This page, sir, shows a series of screenshots from CCTV footage taken in Salisbury on that Friday, between 2:24 in the afternoon and 9:53 in the evening, showing Dawn out and about on what was obviously a sunny summer's day. Thank you. There is much less evidence, by contrast, about the crucial events of the next morning. The only direct evidence we have about what took place in the flat on Muggleton Road during the morning of Saturday, the 30th of June, are the accounts given by Charlie Rowley. His evidence will explain how, between about 9:30 and 10 o'clock that morning, he gave Dawn what he thought was a bottle of perfume that he had found, how he helped her by opening the packaging and attaching the nozzle, in the process spilling some of the contents on his own hands, and how Dawn then took the bottle and applied what she also thought was perfume. After all, why should she think anything else? To her wrists. Charlie Rowley's evidence will also cover Dawn's subsequent collapse, how he called the emergency services, and how later in the day he himself developed symptoms, collapsed, and was taken to hospital. Further, we will hear detailed evidence regarding, first of all, the bottle itself. If we could have, please, INQ 005126, page 6, thank you. Secondly, the cardboard packaging that it was found in, INQ 005126-1. Thank you. And also the plastic packaging in which the bottle and the applicator appear to have been sealed inside the box. If we could have, please, INQ 004675. Thank you. So this photo shows one of the two bits of plastic packaging that were found and which, as I've said, were believed to have held the components of the perfume bottle inside the cardboard box.
What is it, Mr. O'Connor? Shaped or moulded plastic?
So we'll hear more evidence about that, but this is not shaped or moulded plastic.
It's not.
These are
Just bags.
appear to be plastic bags. And so we'll also hear about the scene at Muggleton Road and where the various items that I've mentioned were discovered when the flat was subsequently searched. And to give one example, if we could have, please, INQ 00512610. Yes, so there is a photo of one corner of the kitchen in Muggleton Road. We're mainly looking at the bin, but we can see just on the floor next to the bin, that cardboard box. That's where it was found, discarded, in fact, with the bus ticket from the journey from Simon at the floor,
Yep.
and the cardboard box was found discarded. Well, one may imagine that someone tried to get it in the bin and didn't quite make it. Thank you, we can take that down. So I'm going to move on to the third of those issues I mentioned earlier, and that is the question of medical treatment. Medics, and then taken to Salisbury District Hospital. We will hear evidence from those who provided pre-hospital care and from those who treated them once they arrived in hospital. On one level, this evidence will form part of the narrative. It's an important building block to establishing how and why Dawn died. That is not, however, where the medical issues end. There are further questions that have been included within the scope of the investigation at the particular request of the Sturgess family. Understandably, they seek answers as to why Dawn died when others who were also poisoned with Novichok, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, Charlie Rowley, also the police officer Nick Bailey, did not. They've asked whether this could have been the result of the somewhat different treatment that Dawn received, different in particular to the emergency treatment given to Charlie Rowley only a few hours after Dawn had been taken to hospital. They wish to understand why doctors, apparently acting on information from the police, initially theorised that Dawn's symptoms may have been caused by a drug overdose, and whether this theory was dismissed as quickly as it should have been. They ask whether Dawn's medical treatment was properly informed by lessons that had been learnt, or at least that should have been learnt, months earlier in treating the Skripals. And ultimately, of course, they wish to know whether anything that may have gone wrong in Dawn's treatment could have made a difference to her chances of survival. To use a legal term, if there were failings, were they causative? In addition to the evidence of those who cared for the patients and of, for example, the pathologist who conducted Dawn's post-mortem, you will be assisted in considering these issues by expert witnesses who have prepared independent reviews of what happened at the request of the inquiry and who will give oral evidence in respect of pre-hospital care. The expert in question is Mr. Mark Faulkner, and in the context of hospital care, you will hear evidence from Dr. Jasmine Saw, Professor Jerry Nolan, and Dr. David Minks. So I now come to the issue of responsibility for the Skripal poisonings. the key questions that arise can be shortly stated, but they are of the utmost gravity. Who was it who poisoned Sergei and Yulia Skripal? When, as everyone will be aware, since the time of the poisonings in 2018, the British government took the unusual step of publicly attributing responsibility to the Russian government. On Monday, the 12th of March 2018, a week and a day after the poisoning, the then Prime Minister Theresa May made a memorable statement to the House of Commons, and if we could have it please, it's INQ 005992.
It is now grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
Thank you. A month later, on the 13th of April 2018, there was a further important development when Sir Mark Sedwill, the then UK National Security Advisor, wrote a public letter to the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, in which he set out what amounted to the British government's case in support of its assertion that Russia had been responsible for the poisoning. The letter is at INQ 003070. If we can go, as we have done, to the third page, we can see that Sir Mark's summary was that only Russia has the technical means, operational experience and motive for the attack on the Skripals, and that it is highly likely that the Russian state was responsible. There is, he said, no plausible alternative explanation. Thank you. We shall, sir, consider the assessments in Sir Mark's letter in detail during the rest of the hearings. And 5 months later, as I've already mentioned, in September 2018, the Crown Prosecution Service announced charges, including the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, against 2 Russian men. I will return to them in a moment. So I've already emphasised this morning, and indeed you have said words to a similar effect, that this inquiry, and in particular